The case you're about to see is fictional, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the public.
It began with somebody shouting, a man shouting. He sounded so really scared, frightened. His voice was high-pitched, like a screech.
What did this man shout, Miss Chadwick? Do you recall?
He shouted, I thought he shouted, "Fight, there's a fight." Then I saw all these people running across the bar.
You mean the customers present in the first floor bar?
Yes, the guests. Suddenly the whole place was chaotic. People were frantic. I thought they must be running from a fight.
But you soon realised this was not so.
Yes, this smoke, thick black smoke, came belching into the bar like a big mushroom cloud.
You realised there was a fire?
No, just this horrible black smoke.
From which direction did the smoke come?
Poured in through the revolving door of the top floor bar.
Yeah. Now, Miss Chadwick, would you be good enough to step across to this model and indicate where you were standing in relation to the revolving door when the smoke you described swept through?
Following one of the worst fire disasters in the history of Fulchester, Janet Helen Godfrey, a local businesswoman, public figure and proprietrix of several nightclubs and restaurants in the city, has been jointly charged with manslaughter. Her co-defendant, Paul Reginald Flood, was general manager of the Sycamore Grove, the nightclub owned by Mrs Godfrey.
I was coughing and heaving with the smoke. I could hardly see with it.
Lorna Chadwick, a teacher at a Fulchester Comprehensive, is the 9th witness to give the court an account of the events inside the nightclub when fire broke out.
Were attempts made to escape from the bar?
A crowd of people were trying to get an exit door open, but it were locked. They were smashing a table against the door to get it open.
Would you indicate the position of the exit door on the model?
Here, just here.
Miss Chadwick, how was it possible for you to determine that the exit door was in fact locked?
Well, it was obvious. One man was hysterical, shouting his head off about it being locked, and a crowd of them trying to break the door down.
Were they successful?
I didn't wait to see.
What did you do?
James, he were yelling at me, screaming at me.
James?
My brother James.
I see. Carry on.
Well, he pushed me across the bar, through the double doors out into the passageway.
You referred to the two double fire doors?
Yes.
Can you recall if these doors were open or were they closed?
They were open, both lots.
Held open or were they fixed back against the walls?
They were up to the walls. Nobody stood there holding them.
So, what have we, Miss Chadwick? Given the fact that the fire began in the ground floor bar, the thick volume of smoke you described emitted from the ground floor was provided free access, was it not, sweeping upstairs past the open fire doors of the lobby, flowing freely into the skylight bar?
Was that a question, Mrs. Fenton?
Yes, my lord.
Well, could you put your questions more simply?
Can you remember if these same doors were open when you arrived at the club earlier that evening?
I don't remember that.
So, Miss Chadwick, with assistance from your brother, you reached the first floor lobby?
Yes. We made our way to the stairs at the end of the passageway, here. Suddenly, everything went dark, black. The lights had failed.
Did the lights come on again? Did any lights come on?
There were no lights.
What happened after the lights failed, Miss Chadwick?
James, he were gripping my arms, guiding me down the stairs. I could feel myself stepping on these bodies, and I looked down and... Oh, God, I was stepping with my heels on this man's face. I remember screaming.
You were still on the stairs at this time?
Yes. Somehow we got down to the ground floor bar.
And what was the scene you encountered?
I could see this fire coming at us, like a ball of flames, like a huge wave. All around me there were people screaming and crying and yelling, clutching at one another, fighting, fists pouring the air. It was like a madhouse.
Quite. Can you say where the fire was most concentrated?
The far side of the ground floor bar was completely ablaze.
Would you indicate which area on the model?
Here, where the bar stood. And flames dancing across the ceiling. And this hissing, a terrible hissing, like snakes, like a pit of snakes. I saw this girl running through this raging inferno, screaming. Wild she was. Her hair was ablaze.
Were any attempts made to quell the fire?
A man was holding an extinguisher. He was swearing and yelling. He kicked out the extinguisher because he couldn't make it work.
The extinguisher wouldn't work.
My lord, the witness stated the man could not make the extinguisher work, which is not to assert.
Yes, Mrs. Fenton, you mustn't put words into the witness's mouth.
My lord. Did the man eventually get the extinguisher to function, Miss Chadwick?
I didn't see. The roof beams over me broke away from the ceiling and crashed down towards me. Suddenly, the floor was alight. I could feel this burning, a terrible burning pain. I screamed so, and then I must have passed out.
Give the witness a chair and a glass of water. Miss Chadwick, would you like a few minutes to gather yourself?
I'm sorry.
I'm quite prepared to adjourn the court for 15 minutes. Don't apologise.
No, please. I'm okay now.
Are you sure?
Thank you.
Miss Chadwick, did you often go to the Sycamore Grove?
The first time I'd ever been there. I went with my brother, James, and my boyfriend. We'd been invited to a 21st birthday party. The Skylight Bar had been specially booked.
Whose birthday party was it?
Tom Worsley's. We'd all known him from school, my lord. 21 that day, key to the door and all that. But he died.
Do you know how many of your fellow guests at the party died?
17. Friends of mine, mostly.
Yes, Mrs. Fenton.
And what of your brother James, Miss Chadwick, and your boyfriend?
A beam fell on James and knocked him out. He was badly burnt and taken to hospital.
Where did you next see your brother?
At Fulchester General. I was in the same hospital receiving treatment for burns.
What was his condition?
Very critical.
How severely was he burned?
All over. He died an hour later.
I see.
Yes. On December 18th. Just in time for Christmas.
And your boyfriend?
He was unharmed.
That at least is something.
Except he's not my boyfriend anymore.
Oh?
Well, who can blame him? I'm not as pretty as I was.
Thank you, Miss Chadwick. I regret the distress my questions must have caused you. Please, will you remain where you are?
Can I stand up now?
Of course. Thank you. Mr. Ellis?
My lord, I have no questions for this witness.
Miss Parkinson?
I shall not detain you any longer than necessary, Miss Chadwick. May I ask you to describe the reaction of your fellow guests once it had become general knowledge that fire had broken out?
Terrible. Shouting and screaming. Everyone was frantic.
Would panic be an apt word?
Absolutely. A most terrible panic. People were fighting at one another to get out. Scratching at the doors. It was horrendous.
Now, Miss Chadwick, presumably at such a celebration, alcoholic drinks were available.
There was plenty to drink.
The wine flowed, so to speak.
Everyone was having a good time.
What time did the party begin?
8:30.
What time did fire break out?
Around about 11.
3 hours. Quite a fair amount of alcohol would have been consumed during that period of time. Would you accept that the alcohol you consumed impaired the swiftness of your reactions? Well, it would be reasonable to conclude so, would it not?
Possibly.
The combination of high spirits and alcohol would surely have slowed the reactions and dulled the senses of yourself and your fellow guests.
The fire and the panic soon woke us.
Now, turning to the matter of the thick black smoke. I believe you told my learned friend here that the smoke affected your eyes.
I could hardly see with it. The milk got down my throat. I was retching. I nearly threw up.
Right. Now, you told the court that at one point after the fire had broken out, the lights were extinguished.
Well, that's correct.
How soon after you realized there was a fire did the lights fail?
3 or 4 minutes, I suppose.
But the fire, you say, was accompanied by thick black smoke which stung your eyes, obscuring visibility. How could you tell if the lights had been extinguished when you were so engulfed?
The place went black, snapped, just like that. The place was in darkness.
Well, then again, you describe how you stepped on some poor creature's face. Was it the face of a man or a woman?
I've said it was a man's face.
Now, you are certain?
I shall never forget it.
How can you be so certain, Miss Chadwick, if, as you say, the premises have been thrown into darkness?
I saw that poor man's dead face.
I put it to you, Miss Chadwick, that you couldn't possibly have seen unless the house lights had remained on, according to safety regulations.
The place was pitch black, the lights went out and none came on.
I suggest that is a conclusion made in hindsight, Miss Chadwick.
I was there, you weren't.
Just answer the questions, please, Miss Chadwick.
How did your brother die, Miss Chadwick? Was it as a result of the burns he received?
No, not the burns. They said he died from smoke fumes.
Oh, I see. Well, of course, we've already read prior to these hearings your vivid description of a young lady running through the raging inferno with her hair ablaze. The young lady in question, did she die as a result of the fire, do you happen to know?
Survived.
Still with us, then? Horrific though your description of her condition surely was.
I told what I saw.
Indeed, Miss Chadwick. Well, of course, readers of the Daily Globe in their millions will be familiar with your version of accounts. Nightclub Holocaust.
My lord.
Lorna tells of a night of
relevant?
horror. My lord, the Sycamore Grove fire has attracted the widest possible attention in the media. The imputation of much of that report has been disadvantageous in the extreme to my client.
I have already instructed the jury, Miss Parkinson, as you know, that they should totally disregard all they may have read or heard about this case before the trial began.
I'm interested in examining, my lord, to what extent ulterior motives may have coloured this witness's account of the events.
Yes, that is a rather different point, which you may pursue.
I'm obliged, my lord. Why did your article with your byline appear in the Daily Globe, Miss Chadwick?
They gave me a contract.
Of an exclusive nature?
Yes.
I didn't get that, Miss Chadwick. Shall I repeat the question?
An exclusive contract.
I put it to you that your evidence here today has been exaggerated to support and enhance your newspaper story.
That is not
It's
so.
no accident that the sensational tone of your newspaper account has found its way into this court. You've merely stuck to your highly coloured version.
No words could ever describe the horror of that night.
Well, Miss Chadwick, you've certainly made a good stab at it. How much did the newspaper pay you? Answer that, would you please?
£500.
£500. And is this article all you agreed to provide?
No.
No. Would you kindly elaborate?
The newspaper, they want my impressions of the trial when it's over.
And how much will you be paid for these impressions?
£500.
And is this additional journalism subject to any proviso?
I don't understand.
I'm sure you do. Does your contract with the Daily Globe contain any rider? Is it subject to any particular outcome of this court?
If the accused are found guilty.
And if found guilty, Miss Chadwick, do you stand to make any further financial gain?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so? Come now, Miss Chadwick, are you certain? Haven't proceedings for damages been instituted against the accused?
Yes.
On your behalf?
What so?
And if successful, you stand to gain a considerable amount of money.
Possibly.
Several £1,000s at the very least.
That, Miss Parkinson, will be for another court to decide.
My lord. In any event, Miss Chadwick, your £1,000 payment for journalism will be very small beer. But, should the defendants be found guilty in this court, is it not the case that your suit for damages will be considerably enhanced,
I don't know.
offering you the possibility of a very much larger sum in settlement?
Not for me to say.
Put it to you, Miss Chadwick, that the version of events you've offered this court has been calculated to aid your suit for criminal liability against the defendants.
Don't I deserve something?
What do you deserve, Miss Chadwick?
Compensation. I've been scarred for life and me looks ruined. All want me now.
So you need to make future provision for yourself.
That's one way of putting it.
And in order to do so, I put it to you that the content of your evidence has been couched in highly prejudicial terms.
Would you describe the events which led up to the outbreak of the fire?
I was just here, serving behind the ground floor bar in the Melody Lounge. We were busy as hell, customers standing 5 deep, people shouting orders. I turned away to the till to change a £5, when suddenly I heard somebody, a woman I think, screaming. I turned round and suddenly saw this blaze at the far side of the bar, just here. Flames shooting up the wall to the ceiling. Suddenly the place was alight.
Where was the fire concentrated?
Just here, behind the bar.
Behind the bar. Was the club installed with a fire alarm system?
Yes, it was tested once a month to make sure it worked.
And where were the facilities for activating the fire alarm system?
There were 2 switches, one behind each of the bars, on each floor.
When the fire broke out, did you attempt to sound the fire alarm?
Oh, The heat was so intense, the flames... Suddenly the whole bar was ablaze.
Was the alarm sounded on the first floor, in the skylight bar?
I believe not.
How did the fire spread?
It was just like a wave breaking over the bar. The smoke was very heavy. People were passing out and rolling down the stairs. The fire spread so quickly that some customers were engulfed in flames where they sat.
What did you do?
I put a handkerchief over my mouth and ran for the exit door here.
Was the door marked exit?
Yes. There was an exit sign illuminated over the door.
Yes, go on, Mr. Reynolds.
I got about halfway across the bar when suddenly the place went black. The lights failed. I tripped over somebody and fell to the floor, and several people tumbled on top of me. But I managed to crawl to the door, and then the emergency lights came on.
Are you sure about that?
Yes, but they failed a few minutes later.
I wonder why that was.
Well, the fire burnt out the emergency generator, I should think.
How did you eventually manage to escape from the premises?
I got out through this exit door here to the street. There were several men in their shirt sleeves standing on the pavement. They were screaming that their wives were still inside.
Have you any notion at all, Mr. Reynolds, as to how the fire might have started?
None. It just seemed to appear from nowhere.
One final point. Did you see Mr. Flood anywhere on the premises during the outbreak?
No, I didn't.
Had you seen him at all during the evening?
Earlier on, just before we opened.
Yes, thank you. Would you please return to the witness box? Now, as head barman of the ground floor bar, the Melody Lounge, what apart from service to the customers did your duties entail?
When I arrived in the evening, I'd open the bar, stock the tills with cash, and make sure my staff had turned up before we opened for business.
Who laid down what your duties were?
Mr. Flood.
You're referring to the defendant, Paul Flood, who was the general manager of this establishment?
Yes.
Whose responsibility was it to ensure that the exit doors on the ground floor were unlocked?
Mr. Flood did that.
Every night?
Yes.
And who was responsible for it when Mr. Flood was away on holiday?
Oh, he never took a holiday. We were constantly short-staffed. He could never be spared.
Did the same arrangement apply to the skylight bar? Did Mr. Flood undertake to unlock the exit door each night on the first floor?
I don't know about that.
You don't know? But surely that must have been common knowledge amongst the staff?
I suppose so.
You suppose so? In any event, the exit doors on the ground floor on the night in question were indeed unlocked.
Yes.
But not, as it turned out, the exit doors on the first floor.
Apparently not.
Was Mr. Humphreys the head barman of the Skylight Bar on duty this particular night?
Yes. He died in it, poor beggar.
Several witnesses have testified to the effect that the double fire doors on the first floor corridor were both open, hooked securely to the wall. Could you offer any reason why this should be so?
Somebody must have fixed them that way, I should think.
Or why were the fire doors left open, Mr. Reynolds?
I've no idea. We had clear instructions to keep all fire doors closed.
Who instructed you so?
Mr. Flood.
Have you any notion as to who might have opened them?
Well, customers would often hook them back to let some fresh air into the top floor bar.
But were not fire notices fixed to the doors with clear instructions to all that the door should be kept closed at all times?
Originally there were, but some students pinched them one night.
Were they not replaced by new fire notices?
No, they weren't.
And when were the fire notices removed?
Early part of the autumn. The university had a party in the Skylight Bar. That night the notices went missing.
Mr. Reynolds, were you and the rest of the staff ever put through any paces in terms of fire drill?
There was never a fire drill.
Can you recall any arrangements made by the management to lessen the danger in the event of fire?
Well, we had a code, a phrase that would be spoken over the tannoy in the event of a fire breaking out, something innocuous that wouldn't panic the customers.
What phrase was employed for this? Yes?
Muffin the mule.
Muffin the mule. And who chose this portentous expression?
My lord.
Mr. Flood.
Would you say that Mr. Flood took his responsibilities for fire prevention seriously?
Very seriously. He took everything seriously.
And whatever became of dear old Muffin the mule?
But there was just no time to pass the word. The fire was raging across the bar, burning up the furniture, the decorations...
The decorations?
Well, yes, there was an artificial hardboard ceiling suspended over the bar, and hanging from it were various draperies, decorations, fabrics, sacking, artificial palm tree branches, that sort of stuff. All the lights in the bar were concealed in half coconut shells, sort of fancy lampshades.
Was this material fireproofed?
Not as far as I know.
What were the decorations for?
Well, I suppose they were meant to give the place a moody atmosphere.
Whose concept was this?
I've no idea.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Please, would you remain where you are?
Mr. Reynolds, you informed my learned friend that you'd been employed at the Sycamore Grove nightclub for the past 5 years. To whom did you apply for this post initially?
Mr. Flood.
And who interviewed you?
He did.
And who appointed you?
Him again.
Was anyone else present at the interview?
No.
How experienced a barman were you at the time?
Never done the job before.
Did Flood take up your references?
He didn't ask for references. I had none.
So you were appointed to this position without any previous experience and without the support of references?
Mr. Flood needed somebody quickly.
I see. How well did you get on with Mr. Flood?
Quite well. He's a nice bloke. Too much of a worrier.
What would he worry about?
We were constantly short-staffed.
Why was that?
The staff wages were too low.
Yet is it not the case that you yourself remained in this post for some 5 years?
I had to get a lunchtime job serving behind a bar to make up the money.
How frequently did Mrs. Godfrey visit the club?
Once or twice a week.
Were you aware of Mrs. Godfrey involving herself at all in the day-to-day running of the club?
No. She left that side of it to Mr. Flood.
Did Mrs. Godfrey familiarize herself with the staff?
No way. No, Madame Godfrey was too subtle for that.
Very possibly, but what I am trying to establish was whether Mrs. Godfrey imposed herself as your employer.
No, she could have been just another customer.
I see. Thank you. Now, in what way did they conduct their business relationship, Mrs. Godfrey and Mr. Flood?
He was a pushover as far as she was concerned. Any other bloke would have slung his up the way she treated him.
Yes. Now, let us turn to the question.
Since you've raised the matter of the owner-manager relationship, Mr. Ellis, I, for one, would like to hear the witness out on this.
My lord?
She was tight-fisted.
You mean thrifty?
I mean mean. We used to call her Lady Cutback. Every single department in that club was full of tat. The furniture was cut-price nasty, the kitchen equipment was army surplus. She wouldn't even pay for a decent bog roll in the staff lavatory. And that's another thing. One lavatory stuck out in the backyard for men and women. That's how thrifty she was. And she had old Flood by the throat. He genuinely wanted to make improvements to the place, but no, she wouldn't wear it. Took the lot and gave nothing. Well, one day something was going to go wrong, and it did. So if you're looking for somebody to blame, there she sits, Madame Bloody Godfrey.
The case of the Queen against Flood and Godfrey will be continued tomorrow in the Crown Court. The case you're about to see is fictitious, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the public. In the case of the Queen against Godfrey and Flood, the prosecution has suggested that a fire in the Sycamore Grove nightclub, which killed 17 people, was the direct result of gross negligence on the part of its proprietor, Mrs. Janet Godfrey, and her general manager, Paul Flood, both of whom are on trial for manslaughter. The court is now hearing evidence from Rex Meredith, a local self-employed electrician.
Mr. Meredith, did you during the summer of last year have occasion to visit the Sycamore Grove nightclub in pursuance of your trade?
Flood wanted some work done.
It was he who approached you?
He phoned me at home. I work from home, you understand.
Did you discuss this engagement with anyone else at the club?
Just Flood.
What did the work involve?
He wanted some new fixtures in the bar and in the ladies' loo.
In which bar?
The Melody Lounge, whatever it's called. The bar on the ground floor. He wanted some faulty sockets replacing.
Did you supply an estimate for the projected work?
I did.
Yeah. Written or verbal?
Well, I told him how much the work had cost after I'd had a look to see what was needed.
And did you form any opinion regarding the overall condition of the electrical wiring in these premises?
Yeah, it was fine, generally speaking, except for those sockets, the light switch in the ladies' loo, and a faulty fan behind the bar.
Behind the bar in the Melody Lounge?
Yeah.
In what way was it faulty?
Well, the fan was pretty ancient and decrepit. I mean, it'd been there for years. And when you shoved the plug into the socket, it made a crackling noise and there were sparks.
You say sparks flew?
That's what I did say. I mean, the wiring was corroded, rotting, hadn't been looked at for years. The plastic holder of the plug was cracked and loose. I mean, the whole thing, the plug and all, needed replacing.
And were you then commissioned to install a new fan?
No,
Do you know why?
because Flood wouldn't have it done.
Did he give any reason?
Well, apparently Mrs Godfrey wouldn't pay for it, and he could only afford to replace the sockets and the light switch.
Leaving a fan which was the worse for wear still in existence behind the bar,
That's right.
the faulty plug of which tended to give off sparks and in your professional view was a danger.
I told Flood. I said, you need a totally new fixture there. No, he said.
And this dangerous electrical equipment was situated in the precise location behind the bar in the Melody Lounge where the fire subsequently broke out. Thank you, Mr. Meredith.
How much would it have cost to replace this fan, Mr. Meredith?
£60 plus the labour.
And you claim the workers refused because of the cost.
I don't claim anything, that's a fact.
So you may say, Mr. Meredith, but I put it to you that you were, in fact, instructed to replace that fan.
That's not true at all.
And that in hindsight you've sought to cover your reputation by fabricating this whole account of yours.
Look, I offered to replace the damn thing, but Flood said no. No, he said. There was no money left in the kitty, and that was that.
I put it to you that you're lying, Mr. Meredith. Thank you.
How long have you been engaged in this type of work in a self-employed capacity?
3 years now.
Before that?
With Crispin's Electrical Wholesale, Fulchester.
How long were you there?
6 months.
Why did you leave after such a short time?
Had a disagreement
Oh,
with the boss.
you mean you were sacked?
Wouldn't put it quite like that.
How quite would you put it?
I was asked politely to move along.
How many firms had you been with prior to Crispin's?
2 or 3.
2 or 3? Isn't 5 the correct figure, and I remind you, you are under oath.
I didn't keep a list.
What training did you receive?
I started out as an apprentice. I learnt my trade on the job.
Isn't it a fact, Mr. Meredith, that your position as a self-employed jobbing electrician results from the fact that you are unemployable by any reputable Fulchester electrical company?
Who told you that?
Your standard of workmanship is so sloppy and amateurish that employing you would be something of a liability.
I'm never out to work, you know. I'm a busy lad.
Isn't it true that you carry a manual about with you in your back pocket which you proceed to consult whenever you are unsure of an electrical task confronting you?
I've yet to have a dissatisfied customer.
Hasn't that something more to do with your economic level of accounts?
Oh, no, I don't charge what the big companies have to because I don't have their overheads.
I put it to you, Mr. Meredith, that the reason Mr. Flood employed you was because you were cheap. And given the paucity of his budget, he couldn't afford an electrician of greater skill.
Well, that's rubbish.
No further questions.
Several inspections are made in the course of a year to meet the requirements of different acts. The last inspection at the Sycamore Grove was made in August 1980 in connection with the Music, Song and Dancing Act.
Did you meet a representative of the club when you called there?
Yes, Mr. Paul Flood.
How did the efforts of the club to meet your requirements impress you?
A licence was granted.
The fire extinguishers were working, were they?
The legal requirement is for licensed premises to make their own annual checks and to overhaul the extinguishers.
Had this been done?
The club records indicated so.
Who had undertaken the checks?
Mr. Flood.
Were you satisfied that Mr. Flood was competent to undertake this task?
We always prefer fire prevention specialists to do this task.
Now, would you explain why it is necessary for such establishments to ensure that their fire doors are kept closed?
To stop the smoke from spreading to other parts of the building.
And are fire notices to be displayed indicating that the doors should be kept closed at all times?
That's what the law stipulates.
Have you read the pathologist's report on the victims of the Sycamore Grove fire?
I have.
How do you react to the analysis offered of their deaths?
No deaths were caused by burning. The deaths were caused by the inhalation of smoke fumes. And all the victims occupied the Skylight Bar at the time fire broke out.
Can you describe what happened?
The fire doors on the first floor corridor were left open on this particular night, and the smoke came pouring upwards from the ground floor, fatally affecting many guests on the top floor. If the fire doors had been closed, the smoke could not have passed through into the skylight bar.
Is it a legal requirement, Mr. Stavaker, that all exit doors should remain unlocked?
When members of the public are on the premises, many deaths are caused in fires by the exit facilities being inadvertently locked.
Have you had the opportunity to inspect the records of the Sycamore Grove nightclub for the night of December the 13th last?
Indeed, the records were retrieved from the office on the night of the fire.
Including those relating to the number of guests admitted?
107 guests were admitted to the club that evening.
What is your comment on this?
The club contravened its statutory obligation to admit no more than 100 guests to their premises at one time.
The law was broken?
That's correct.
May the witness be shown Exhibits 7 and 8, please. Do you recognise these items?
I do. They consist of materials used to decorate the Melody Lounge of the Sycamore Grove nightclub.
How did these exhibits come into the possession of the authorities?
They were retrieved from the premises after the fire had been put out.
Given that a worn-out fan, the plug of which was sparking, was in use behind this bar in close proximity to these decorations, would you say that that is the root cause of the fire?
It's highly probable, certainly.
But has the exact cause of this fire yet been determined?
No, my lord. The building was virtually destroyed. It's proved impossible to establish absolutely the root cause of the fire.
As Fire Prevention Officer of the Fulchester County Council, what is your comment on the use of such decorations in places of public entertainment?
I would advise against it.
And did you offer any such advice to the management of the Sycamore Club?
I did.
To whom specifically?
To Mr. Flood.
And with what result?
My advice was unheeded.
I'm obliged.
Mr. Stavaker, with whom did you normally deal on your visits of inspection at the Sycamore Grove?
Mr. Flood.
And were you ever involved in any discussion with the club's owner, Mrs. Janet Godfrey?
No, sir.
Was she ever present, in fact?
I never saw her.
No. No, quite. Thank you, Mr. Stavaker.
Mr. Stavaker, in whose name was the Sycamore Grove licensed?
Mrs. Janet Helen Godfrey.
And whose specific legal responsibility is it to ensure that the conditions of the license are fulfilled?
The owner and proprietor, in this case, Mrs. Godfrey.
When you inspected the premises last, was there a fire certificate on display?
Yes, in the foyer.
As required by law?
Yes.
Were the fire doors closed and the exit doors open?
Yes, everything was in order.
Fire notices were displayed on the fire doors?
They were.
Now, on the question of fire extinguishers, does it mean that if they failed to work, they had not been subjected to a proper inspection and overhaul?
Not necessarily. Fire extinguishers, particularly the dry powder sort, often seize up. They're liable to corrosion.
There's no legal obligation to conduct regular fire drills on premises such as these, is there?
None.
The license granted to the Sycamore Grove, that was not subject to your advice being followed concerning the decorations in the Melody Lounge, was it?
No such rider was stipulated.
Is it not common practice for such establishments to decorate their premises in this way?
Unfortunately, it's often so.
There's nothing illegal about it.
No.
Thank you.
Unless your lordship has any questions of this witness, that is the case for the prosecution.
Thank you, Mr. Stavaker.
My lord.
Mr. Ellis?
My lord, I call Janet Helen Godfrey. Mrs. Godfrey, how long have you resided in the county borough of Fulchester?
All my life. I was born here.
And was your late husband Samuel Godfrey a man who during his lifetime undertook some degree of public responsibility?
He was a city councillor for 20 years and served a term as mayor.
And have you, Madam Mayor, asked involved yourself in similar public enterprise?
I'm a magistrate and city councillor.
Is that the total extent of your contribution to public life?
No, I'm also chairperson of a Fulchester charity concerned with the welfare of underprivileged children.
Thank you. Now, turning to the matter of the Sycamore Grove nightclub, Mrs. Godfrey, how did you come to acquire it?
Oh, I didn't. My husband bought this property. He owned a number of similar establishments in Fulchester.
Which I take it you inherited following his most untimely death.
Yes.
When did your husband's death occur?
Oh, he was killed in a road accident 5 years ago.
So you were left with the burden of administering a string of these entertainment establishments?
Yes. Yes, I inherited 2 nightclubs, of which the Sycamore Grove was one, and 4 restaurants. I've appointed general managers to take entire charge of their affairs.
And what is the extent of their responsibility?
Oh, total. They only come to me if they have a problem which they themselves cannot solve.
Do they administer through a fixed budget?
Oh, but my budgets aren't fixed. I mean, they're flexible. It's that sort of business.
So there are no restrictions placed upon your managers budget-wise?
No sensible restrictions.
I understand.
None whatever.
Would you describe how the appointment of Paul Flood as general manager of the Sycamore Grove came about?
Well, he'd worked for my husband for some years. He'd successfully managed 2 of Sam's restaurants, and after Sam died, Paul seemed the obvious choice.
Do you now regret the appointment of Paul Flood?
I think perhaps, on reflection, managing restaurants was a rather less complex matter than a nightclub. As things turned out, the job proved too much for him. But I blame myself for this, naturally.
How involved were you in the day-to-day running of the club?
Hardly at all, which was perhaps a mistake. I signed the checks and kept a weather eye, and that was all.
Did Mr. Flood ever discuss his budget?
But it never came up.
He appeared happy or unhappy with your provision?
It was never discussed. Well, I assume, therefore, that he was satisfied that the budget was adequate. Well, he certainly never complained.
And how would you have reacted had he so complained?
Well, naturally, if justified, the budget would have been adjusted.
What is your reply to Mr. Reynolds' accusation that you were penny-pinching in your funding of the club and that you domineered and bullied your manager?
Well, he isn't telling the truth.
And how do you respond to his suggestion that you refused to pay for the replacement of an electric fan?
It's utterly absurd.
Mrs. Godfrey, do you feel in any way responsible for this tragedy?
I cannot. My involvement with the club was minimal. That is why Paul was employed in the first place, to cope. And he clearly failed to cope.
But, Mrs. Godfrey, it might be argued that as the owner and proprietor of this establishment, the ultimate responsibility for the safety of the clientele was yours.
But one must delegate. It's impossible to check that a person is doing their job to total satisfaction. One must trust one's employees. With certain reservations, I trusted Paul. Misplaced, I now grant. But I really cannot accept responsibility for what has occurred. A drunken train driver, after all, is criminally liable for a train crash, not the board of the British Rail.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mrs. Godfrey. Please remain where you are.
Miss Parkinson, are you going to begin?
Indeed, my lord.
Yes, well, let's get on.
Mrs. Godfrey, would you describe yourself as a thrifty woman?
Well, careful, certainly. One has to be these days.
Quite so, Mrs. Godfrey, but it has been suggested that you were parsimonious in your funding of the Sycamore.
But I absolutely deny that. If a larger budget had been required, Paul would have advised me so, which he did not.
How much did you pay, Mr. Flood?
£4,500 a year.
£4,500 a year? It's not much to support himself, his wife and 2 children on.
Well, many manage it, and Paul certainly never complained.
Is he the complaining type?
No, not at all, but jobs are scarce, particularly in these parts. A man of his age would find it difficult to get another job.
So it was a question of take it or leave it.
I didn't mean to imply that. Simply that these are difficult times for everyone.
Is it not a fact that you bullied this man mercilessly? You browbeat him, you dominated him with total cynicism. Not only did you refuse him a living wage, you refused him the funds to run the club as he wanted.
But that's a complete distortion. There's not a word of truth in it, as I'm sure you know.
You held Paul Flood in a stranglehold. You threatened that if he left your employment, you would use your powerful social position to ensure he failed to find employment anywhere else.
That's nonsense. Why should I bother?
Because you were aware you could not possibly obtain the services of another manager for the amount you were prepared to pay Mr. Flood.
Given the man's obvious shortcomings, he was lucky to have the job.
I see, Mrs. Godfrey. Yes, you've made your attitude perfectly clear. And I put it to you that you are trying to evade liability for this tragedy by hanging the blame on your employee.
Mr. Flood is your client, Miss Parkinson. No doubt that is the impression you would wish to create of me.
Your attitude here today suggests a shoddy picture of someone trying to wriggle out of their responsibilities. That's all.
You're aware, I'm sure, Mrs. Godfrey, that the Sycamore Grove was an entertainment establishment licensed in your name.
Yes, of course.
And that consequently you were charged with the legal responsibility for its constitution. Well, Mrs. Godfrey?
Well, in general terms, quite so.
What does that mean?
I should have thought my client's answer was perfectly clear, my lord.
On the vague side, my lord, I think.
Yes, Mrs. Godfrey, be good enough to elaborate.
Certainly, I accept responsibility for the overall constitution of the club, but not the detailed day-to-day management of it, which I delegated to another.
So the position, in fact, is, Mrs. Godfrey, that you do not accept ultimate responsibility.
Well, not given the wide-ranging terms you placed before me.
Where exactly did you see your responsibility ending, Mrs.
Well,
Godfrey?
I
Please
tried to
answer
see
precisely.
that the club was run on the right lines.
Which implies, does it not, ensuring adequate management?
Well, that certainly would come into it.
Was Mr. Flood, in your view, adequate?
Well, given hindsight, obviously not.
But prior to the catastrophic events which have brought us all here today, would you say that Mr. Flood was up to the job of manager?
Well, I would hardly have continued to employ him if I was convinced otherwise.
So if I may put it like this, his failure was also your failure.
But I surely cannot be blamed for unforeseen failures in employees.
Unforeseen failures, Mrs. Godfrey? Did you not express in answer to both my learned friends certain dissatisfactions you harboured with regard to Mr. Flood?
I would like to say that my reservations about Paul at this time were slight. I repeat, the British Rail cannot be blamed for...
Please, Mrs. Godfrey, we've already heard you on the matter of the British Rail. I think there is another analogy which might be more appropriate. That of the American president who said the buck stops here. Don't you think perhaps, Mrs. Godfrey, you're passing on your share of the buck?
No, not at all.
What exactly were Mr. Flood's shortcomings, Mrs. Godfrey?
Well, he could never hold down staff.
Wasn't that perhaps because your wages were somewhat less than adequate?
But my other nightclub and restaurants have nothing like the turnover in staff experienced at the Sycamore Club.
Did you personally pay the bills for services rendered to all your establishments?
Well, I signed the cheques.
Why was that?
Well, it was my
You
responsibility.
spoke of delegation, Mrs. Godfrey. Surely delegation means letting those responsible do their job.
But I didn't prepare the accounts or write out the cheques. I merely signed them.
A rather important, if not vital, function. Why was it that there were only one set of lavatories for the public on the premises?
Well, they seemed perfectly adequate.
That was your opinion?
Absolutely. Well, the premises are not that large. I decided that it was perfectly acceptable for customers in the Skylight Bar to descend the stairs to use the downstairs toilets. Well, that can hardly be described as a hardship.
You say you decided this?
Absolutely.
So you did involve yourself in the actual running of the club? Decisions were imposed by you?
Not imposed. We discussed the matter.
Did you also discuss the matter of the Mr. Meredith's estimate for electrical repairs?
Well, I left all such matters as this to Paul.
Such matters as what?
Well, the hiring of tradespeople for minor tasks.
You regarded the safe installation of electrical equipment as a minor consideration?
No, of course not.
The need for safety was a triviality?
But you're twisting my words.
You refused to meet the cost of replacing the fan behind the Melody Lounge bar,
But
didn't
it
you?
was never put to me.
And as a result, a faulty plug giving out sparks was left unrepaired, causing a risk to life and limb.
I knew nothing of it.
You paid the bill, did you not?
I signed a cheque.
To all intents and purposes, you paid the bill. And I suggest to you at the same stage, determined how much that bill would be. Thus you endangered the lives of your customers by not permitting adequate electrical installations.
What, at the cost of a mere £60 or £70? This is nonsense.
When did you last visit your club before the night of the fire?
Oh, a few evenings before.
Did you visit the Skylight Bar?
Yes,
Were the fire doors in the passageway outside closed?
I believe so.
Don't you know?
Well, my visit was a social one. I didn't notice particularly.
Did you observe that there were no fire notices on display?
No, I did not.
Another minor matter, another triviality.
Well, I was with friends. I was not on a tour of inspection.
You denied authorization for new fire notices to be purchased.
No authorization was sought.
Really, on such an essential matter?
Because Paul is the manager, not me. He had full authority.
Then why did he neglect the task?
You would do better to ask him.
Were the fire extinguishers regularly checked and overhauled by a fire prevention company?
I believe not.
Why so?
Well, Paul undertook the task.
Because you refused to pay for specialized services.
I repeat, all such management details...
Details? We're talking about the safety of your customers, Mrs. Godfrey, the people you made your profit from.
I employed Paul Flood with a specific brief of handling all such day-to-day matters.
Was a member of staff engaged specifically to check up on fire safety, to ensure that exit doors were unlocked and fire doors open, that the fire alarm system worked, and so forth?
Well, it was Paul's job to undertake or delegate these responsibilities.
My question was,
there was no one additionally employed.
Was the club not understaffed?
Not that I was aware.
Were you not asked to engage an additional member of staff to execute these duties?
I received no such request.
But in his statement to the police, Mr. Flood said he made several such requests.
He's simply lying.
Did you not see the necessity of such an engagement?
But it's not my place.
You owned this establishment, Mrs.
As
Godfrey.
I am aware.
Did you not then consider an extra staff member necessary to ensure safety facilities were properly ordered?
It was Paul's job to tell me what was needed. Had he done so, I would have complied.
I put it to you, Mrs. Godfrey, that you refused to pay for necessary electrical installation, denied funds for new fire door notices, failed to underwrite the cost of extinguisher overhaul by fire prevention specialists, and rejected repeated requests for the engagement of an additional member of staff.
That's not so.
It was your absolute responsibility to ensure that, first, Mr. Flood was up to the job, second, that he was executing it adequately. Third, that funds were available to ensure that safety was maintained. You failed in this lamentably, and I therefore submit that you are jointly responsible with Paul Flood for these tragic deaths.
Mrs. Godfrey, please return to the dock.
The case of the Queen against Godfrey and Flood will be concluded tomorrow in the Crown Court. The case which you're about to see is fictitious, but the procedure is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the public. Janet Godfrey and Paul Flood are jointly charged with the manslaughter of 17 people who died as a result of a fire in a Fulchester nightclub, of which Mrs. Godfrey was the owner and Flood its general manager. The deaths are claimed by the prosecution to be the direct consequence of gross negligence. Counsel for Paul Flood has called her first witness, Dr. Joseph Wilmer of Fulchester Institute of Technology.
The type of easy chairs used in the club were upholstered with plastic polyurethane foam. This became lethal within seconds of catching fire, and the victims died from inhaling fumes containing poisonous cyanide gases.
Doctor, do I understand you to be saying that polyurethane foam, once ignited, emits cyanide gases?
You understand me, absolutely, yes. The fire started on the ground floor, and the smoke which contained this poison rose to the top floor bar and entered the mouths and lungs of the victims.
Does death from such poisonous gases occur frequently?
On average, 100 people die in this country every year from inhaling these lethal gases. A fire in the Manchester branch of Woolworths, in which 10 people died, first drew public attention to this problem, but in fact it's been with us for many years. Since the end of the war, in fact.
I'm much obliged to you, Doctor. Thank you.
I have simply one point, Doctor, on a matter of clarification, if you will bear with the layman's ignorance.
I'll try.
The polyurethane foam contained in the upholstery of chairs used in the Sycamore Grove nightclub. Would you comment on its general use in furniture?
In recent years, 95% of all chairs and sofas have contained polyurethane foam.
So furniture upholstered in this particular material would not necessarily be cheap or inferior?
Not at all. I mean, most people are sitting on bombs in their own living rooms. You can find this foam in almost anybody's house.
I see. Yes. That's all I have for you, Doctor. Thank you.
Doctor, would you agree that before gases of the nature you describe may be emitted, there must first be a fire?
Well, obviously.
And that your evidence, however fascinating, does not affect this central issue? Fire broke out, inadequate safety facilities existed, and as a consequence many died. The cause of their deaths has relevance only in this context.
Had it not been for the existence of these lethal gases, could it have been the case that many, if not all the victims, might in fact have been with us today?
That's absolutely true. Of course, one can't swear there would have been no deaths. Some may have perished by suffocation, but certainly nothing like the toll that resulted.
So this suggests a tragedy which was the result of misadventure. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. You may step down.
My lord, I call Paul Reginald Flood. Mr. Flood, though jointly charged with manslaughter, you are, of course, separately represented in this court.
I believe Mrs. Godfrey was of the opinion
Mr.
that...
Flood, you really must speak up, you know, so that everyone can hear you.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Please direct your voice towards the jury. It's by them that you should wish to be heard.
Mrs. Godfrey felt that I was to blame, and in any case it was impossible. I could never afford the kind of legal representation she is engaged. With all due respect to you, Miss Parkinson, I didn't mean...
It's quite all right, Mr. Flood. Money can't buy everything. How do you answer Mrs. Godfrey's accusation?
Well, I really don't believe that the fire was my fault. I can't see any way in which I could have prevented what happened.
Do you then consider Mrs. Godfrey to possess any degree of responsibility?
No, I don't, not really. There have been so many accusations and counter-accusations. People have been so ready to rush into judgment. How can Mrs. Godfrey be held responsible? I just can't see it.
Then if the fault lies anywhere, to whom or to what do you point?
Fate. It was fate.
How have you responded to public reaction over this case?
Well, it's understandable, certainly, but there have been so many threats, obscene phone calls, abuse, poison pen letters. It wasn't safe to send my children to school.
Did you ask the police for protection?
I really don't believe the police were prepared to take this matter seriously.
An allegation of some import, Mr. Flood.
I found myself friendless during this business. Both I and my family have been pilloried.
My lord, I've been terribly patient, but the story of Mr. Flood's sad and loveless life is hardly relevant to this matter.
My lord, this defendant has been crucified in the press. The man and his family have been subject to a McCarthy-style witch hunt. Not only has he been turned into a scapegoat, but he's been characterized in some quarters as a kind of public enemy.
Yes, Miss Parkinson, but you have made this justified point on a number of occasions. Please don't labour it.
Very well, my lord. Mr. Flood, would you describe your professional relationship with Mrs. Godfrey?
Our relationship was very formal. I felt very much the employee in her presence, hireling, if you understand me.
Which you were, her employee?
Yes, an employee.
Were you happy with the budget you were allowed?
It became a source of considerable anxiety. The Sycamore Grove was, what shall I say, somewhat starved of funds.
Would you give specific instances?
Well, furniture had to be bought from second-hand and cut-price shops. There was dry rot, woodworm, damp in every room in the place. The interior partitions were made of plywood.
Did this pose a fire hazard?
Well, the place was like a tinderbox. I wanted the interior partitions rebuilt in brick, but this was denied. Toilet facilities for the first floor bar were drawn up in terms of plans and planning permission, only to be squashed by Mrs. Godfrey. Also, there wasn't any money available for new interior decorations. We had to put up with something that had been there for 5 years or more.
You're referring to the coconut lampshades and the other decorations adorning the Melody Lounge?
Yeah.
Did it occur to you that these materials might be a fire hazard?
I regret not. I simply saw it as a means of making the place more attractive to the customers, even though it was beginning to get a bit tatty after all this time.
What would you say that Mrs. Godfrey's major consideration with regard to the Sycamore Club was?
To make as much money as possible.
Now, whose responsibility was it to ensure the exit doors were unlocked?
I myself would unlock the exit doors on the ground floor. The exit doors to the Skylight Bar were unlocked by the head barman.
The late Mr. Ted Humphreys?
Yes, that's a responsibility I delegated to him.
Why was that?
My office was on the ground floor, and most of my duties kept me on the ground floor. And since Mr. Humphreys opened up the top floor bar each evening, it seemed sensible to have him also open the one exit door in the bar.
Which it would appear he failed to do on the night in question.
I'm afraid so.
Did you make periodic checks to ensure that the exit doors were unlocked and the fire doors closed?
Yes, whenever possible. I felt we needed someone on the staff specifically for these duties, but Mrs. Godfrey didn't agree. Nobody was regularly available for these tasks, and I was always heavily involved with administrative work.
Which took up most of your time?
Very much so.
How do you account for the absence of fire notices on the fire doors?
Well, the old ones were missing, and Mrs. Godfrey felt unable to invest in new ones.
She flatly refused?
Well, she said she'd reconsider the matter at the end of the financial year.
Which would have been when?
End of December.
Rather late in the day, it would seem. Why was a broken-down fan with corroded wiring and a faulty plug left unreplaced in the Melody Lounge?
Mrs. Godfrey wouldn't pay to have it be replaced.
She did pay for other electrical repairs, didn't she?
Well, she felt the electrician concerned was trying to make more work for himself.
Did you agree?
My opinion was not invited.
How frequently did you check to see that the fire extinguishers were in working order?
Annually, each April.
You overhauled them yourself?
I'm no expert, but yes, I did.
Why weren't fire prevention specialists engaged for the task?
Mrs. Godfrey, look, I don't want to keep pointing the finger.
Would you answer the question?
Mrs. Godfrey was unwilling to pay for specialists.
Now, where were you precisely, Mr. Flood, when the fire broke out?
I was in the kitchen adjoining the Skylight Bar. I suddenly heard all this screaming and shouting coming from the bar.
What did you do?
At first, I thought it was high spirits, some tomfoolery. Then a man, one of the party guests, came staggering into the kitchen, tearing the bow tie from his neck and retching horribly. I ran down the passageway to the bar and I couldn't believe it.
Describe it, Mr. Flood.
Well, the bar was full of thick bilious smoke. There was this terrible commotion among the guests, one awful mad panic. The floor was littered with bodies. People were collapsing everywhere.
How did you react?
I shouted, "Control yourselves or we'll all get killed. Keep calm and we'll get out of here."
Did anyone hear you?
I doubt it. People seemed to have a disregard for everything and everybody. I saw women thrown down and trampled on. I was horror-stricken. It was so ugly and brutal. It was like seeing a lot of wild animals.
You mean, don't you, that there were living beings in danger of losing their lives? They were looking for safety, weren't they?
I appreciate that people do not behave like thinking human beings in a situation like this.
Do you think that the degree of panic contributed to the many deaths?
I'm convinced of it.
What was your next move?
I went back into the kitchen. There was a young man lying on the floor. A girl was kneeling beside him, holding his hand. He seemed to be dying. I went over to him, unbuttoned his shirt, tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it was no good. He died in a few minutes.
Mr. Flood, you expressed your apparently sincere belief in the fact that Mrs. Godfrey could in no way be blamed for the tragic events of last December. Do you still stand by that statement?
It wasn't her fault.
Then whose? Oh, yes, forgive me, you did tell us, didn't you? Fate, it was fate. Unfortunately, Mr. Flood, this court must subject these events to a more deterministic consideration.
Mr. Ellis, are we now to have a metaphysical discussion?
I trust not, my lord.
So do I.
Mr. Flood, having released Mrs. Godfrey of culpability in a rather transparent refusal to speak ill of her, you then proceed to inform my learned friend that she had been a less-than-model employer.
I simply answered with the facts.
I suggest, Mr. Flood, that you wish to have your cake and eat it, On the one hand, you say, oh no, not Mrs. Godfrey's fault. On the other, you tell us that she refused to pay for that, stopped you doing the other. What a stingy, hard-hearted lady. Look how avaricious she was. It was all her fault, really.
I didn't say that.
Are you seriously suggesting that Mrs. Godfrey, a proprietor of considerable means, actually refused to pay for the replacement of an electric fan costing a mere £60? 2 fire notices, and to employ a fire prevention specialist whose services would be required but once a year?
That is the truth.
Is it credible, Mrs. Godfrey would place her professional enterprises at such risk over such comparatively small items of expenditure?
The fact is, she did.
Isn't it the case, Mr. Flood, that your negligence and maladministration created these fire safety hazards?
What do you expect me to say to that?
I will tell you what I do not expect you to say. And that is that you have fabricated this alleged parsimony of Mrs. Godfrey in an attempt to acquit yourself of responsibility.
I did my best within the budgetary provided.
Then why did you remain in Mrs. Godfrey's employ, if you were so dissatisfied?
I can't really answer that.
Oh, but do try, Mr. Flood. I mean, wasn't it your duty to resign if you felt that the good order of the premises was being jeopardized?
Mrs. Godfrey insisted that I stay.
Insisted? How could she insist?
Well, she threatened me. She said she'd see to it that I was unemployable anywhere else in Fulchester.
Well, why should she do that? Were you indispensable?
I was cheap, that's all.
The fact is, isn't it, that your lack of organizational abilities excluded the possibility of similar employment elsewhere?
She made me stay, and I had a wife and family to think of.
I suggest that you were unemployable elsewhere. You were totally dependent upon the patronage of Mrs. Godfrey.
She depended on me.
I suggest you were very well aware of your own inadequacies and knew that you were lucky to have the job that you did have.
Some luck.
I put it to you, Mr. Flood, that you have attempted to colour Mrs. Godfrey's motives in such a way as to enable you to deny the responsibilities with which you were entrusted.
That is just not so.
Your evidence in this regard, I submit, has constituted a pernicious, if somewhat subtle, attempt at the character assassination of your employer. I have no more questions, thank you.
How do you look upon the events which occurred in the Sycamore Grove nightclub in December last year?
It was a terrible tragedy, an unbelievable thing to happen.
Glib words, Mr. Flood.
They are deeply felt.
Do you regard yourself as in any way responsible?
Well, who knows? Nobody can predict a disaster like this. Maybe if I'd done something differently. But I seriously and honestly believe that I did my best with the facilities available to me, and it's easy to be wise after the event.
Do the deaths of 17 citizens of this city play on your conscience?
I don't know how to answer that, I really don't.
A perfectly straightforward question.
No, it isn't. It is not at all. The faces of those dead men and women will haunt me for the rest of my life. Nobody can recover from something like that.
I'm bound to say, Mr. Flood, nor should you. Presumably, however, your plea of not guilty implies that you consider yourself to be free of blame.
Well, of course I blame myself. Who wouldn't? A motorist who kills a pedestrian through no fault of his own will analyse the incident over and over again and never feel entirely free of guilt.
Why were 107 members admitted to the club on the night in question when your licence stipulates a customer capacity of no more than 100?
It's very difficult to keep within the number of specified guests, with people coming and going during the course of a busy working evening.
Didn't this constitute an illegality?
Strictly speaking, yes.
What other way of speaking of it would you have?
Well, I mean, we admitted 7 members above our quota, all right, but if we'd admitted 70, then I could understand this.
7 or 70, you still broke the law.
Not intentionally.
Why do you suppose a number of witnesses in this trial have testified that 3 fire extinguishers failed to work during the crisis?
The extinguishers must have seized up.
All 3?
Well, there's no other explanation.
Or that you failed to overhaul them properly is one explanation.
I overhauled those extinguishers annually, as ordered by the justices.
How competent were you in the use of the instruments needed to overhaul these instruments?
Well, the company supplying the extinguishers was satisfied with my checks.
And what proof is there that these checks were regularly made?
Club records.
Were these subject to independent scrutiny?
Every year when the licence came up for renewal.
By whom?
Fire Prevention Authority.
But we only have your word that these overhauls were actually conducted and logged by you. Come now, Mr. Flood, you pencilled in that log while omitting to conduct the required overhaul. Isn't that the truth? You said you were overworked, understaffed.
That is an appalling suggestion.
Is it? Did you not admit an illegal number of customers on the night of the fire? Why should your account of the extinguisher's overhaul inspire greater confidence?
Because I didn't falsify the extra number of customers we let in that night. How else would you know about it? I was scrupulous about maintaining club records.
Let's press on. If Mrs Godfrey had refused to underwrite the cost of replacing a decrepit fan which had a faulty electrical plug, why did you continue to use it?
Well, we had to use it. The atmosphere in the bar became so smoky and hot.
Such ventilation you considered more vital than safety?
Well, I told Mrs Godfrey over and over again that the fan was on its last legs.
And that satisfied your sense of responsibility? Despite the fact that the plug attached to this fan was faulty and emitting sparks in close proximity to your inflammable decorations?
It was a matter for Mrs Godfrey.
Did you not consider replacing the faulty plug?
Impossible. The wires were corroded. The fan itself should have been pensioned off long before. The whole job lot needed to be replaced.
Mr Flood, why were the double fire doors on the first floor corridor secured in an open position on the night in question?
I cannot explain it.
Who opened them?
Well, customers were always hooking them back.
Because there were no fire door notices instructing the public that the door should be kept closed?
I told Mrs Godfrey.
Yes, you do seem to have spent a lot of time in conference with Mrs Godfrey. Don't you think that your efforts might have been better spent in improvising temporary fire notices?
My job was to report the missing fire notices. I had no time to knock up temporary ones.
No, nor the inclination. You appreciate, don't you, that had it not been for these open fire doors, many, if not all, of the victims might have survived the fire.
It is a terrible fact, but I must resist the suggestion that I am to blame.
Did you make it your practice to go to the club and inspect the premises every night?
I went there every evening.
Did you inspect the premises?
Well, it depended on my other commitments.
Did you not regard it as an absolute necessity regularly to conduct such an inspection?
I had to manage the club single-handed. I had no assistant. I asked Mrs Godfrey for assistance, but she refused.
And did you inspect the exit door attached to the Skylight bar on the night in question to ensure that it was open?
No.
Did anyone so check this door on the night?
This is a responsibility I delegated to the head barman of the Skylight bar.
He's dead, of course.
I believe so.
That's a fact, isn't it?
Yeah.
Conveniently, Mr Flood, I suggest.
My lord.
Mrs Fenton, please frame your questions in terms that the defendant may answer.
My lord, I put it to you that you did not delegate the responsibility for unlocking this exit door to the late Mr Humphreys.
But I tell you,
You forgot to unlock
was...
that door yourself, didn't you? You failed to unlock that exit door.
No.
And now you seek to plant the blame for this criminal omission on the reputation of a dead man. A man who can no longer speak for himself, who cannot answer back.
That's a terrible accusation.
My lord, the witness is obliged to answer proper questions, but not to be subjected to a brutalizing barrage of distressing imputations.
Miss Parkinson, as you are aware, counsel for the prosecution has a duty to press the defendant on matters which in her view are pertinent.
Mr Flood, if you accepted responsibility for unlocking the exit doors on the ground floor, now how is it that this was not extended to the first floor?
Because most of my duties kept me on the ground floor.
Even though you were in the kitchen on the first floor on the night of the fire?
I did say I never went up to the first floor.
If you had this arrangement with the late Mr Humphreys, why was Mr Reynolds, the head barman of the Melody Lounge, not required to open the exit door on his bar?
I have explained on opening up the premises, I would unlock all the exit doors on the ground.
Well, why was no member of the staff other than yourself aware of this arrangement you allege between you and the late Mr Humphreys?
Well, why should they know about it? I told Mr Humphreys I didn't announce it over the tannoy system.
I put it to you that you're lying.
I'm not lying, I
using
promise
Mr.
you I'm not
Humphrey's
lying.
tragic death as a convenient escape hatch.
I'm incapable of such guile, such despicable behaviour.
Are you, Mr Flood? When fire broke out, did you attempt to lend any assistance to its victims?
It was so chaotic.
And so you fled to the kitchen?
It was a hellhole in that bar.
In an attempt to save yourself?
I tried to save a young man's
life. You put your own
life.
safety before that of your customers.
How was I to know all that was going to happen?
That, Mr Flood, begs the question.
Mr Flood, did you do everything in your power to manage the Sycamore Grove nightclub with all reasonable consideration as to the safety of the clients?
Everything possible, believe me.
Did you make every effort to advise Mrs Godfrey as to the shortcomings of the fundings of the said nightclub?
I told her, I warned her.
Unless you have any questions, that is the case for Paul Flood.
Return to the dock. The crime of manslaughter means an unlawful killing. The elements of the offence are identical to those of murder, except that here there is an absence of malice aforethought. If you find that either or both of the accused have committed a grossly negligent act or omission, then you must find for the prosecution. That the deaths were caused inadvertently, or that the accused failed to recognize the danger, is no defense. The prosecution does not have to prove that the accused knew their actions were unlawful or dangerous. What you, as reasonable and sober citizens, have to consider is whether the accused should have been able to recognize the danger. However, it is not enough for the prosecution to assert that Mrs. Godfrey was parsimonious. That would not be a ground for criminal liability. You must be satisfied beyond all reasonable doubt that she was at fault in particular instances. Did she refuse to grant funds for a new electric fan and fire door notices? Did she reject applications for another member of staff? Why did the fire extinguishers fail to work? Was it the result of negligence by Mr. Flood, or because Mrs. Godfrey would not employ fire prevention specialists, or was it for some other reason? Remember, you must consider the evidence against each defendant separately. They are jointly charged, but you may find one of them guilty, or both of them guilty, or neither of them guilty.
Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
We have.
Do you find the defendant, Janet Helen Godfrey, guilty or not guilty of the charge of manslaughter?
Guilty.
Do you find the defendant, Paul Reginald Flood, guilty or not guilty of the charge of manslaughter?
Not guilty.
Flood, you may stand down. Having heard all the evidence, I am quite satisfied that this is a case of gross neglect of essential and elementary precautions. This is a most serious offence. However, I've taken into account your previous good character. Mrs. Godfrey, you will pay a fine of £2,000.